The group Lisa, Jack, Sarah, and Mike had been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the humdrum of city life. They'd read about Black Hollow Forest in a hiker's guide, where tales of eerie sightings were chalked up as local myths. The guidebook dismissed the legends as old superstitions. But once the group arrived, they began to sense an unsettling aura lurking beneath the forest's beauty. They set up camp just as twilight began to fade, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled branches stretching skyward like skeletal hands. The air was thick with the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves, and an unusual silence hung heavy in the air. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching, waiting. As they pitched their tents, Jack chuckled, attempting to break the tension. "Did anyone read up on the ghost stories?" he asked, a teasing lilt in his voice. "Apparently, this place is haunted by an old woodsman. They say he went mad and murdered his family out here." Sarah rolled her eyes, brushing a stray leaf from her hair. "Very funny, Jack. Just what we need a horror story to kick off the night." Mike joined in, grinning. No, he's right. But it's not just one ghost. There's a whole backstory. I read online that this forest is cursed ground, something about settlers going missing hundreds of years ago. People who just vanished without a trace. "Spooky," Lisa murmured, though her eyes darted to the trees. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something hidden within the shadows was listening to every word they said. Night fell quickly, the darkness pressing down on them like a physical weight. They built a fire, but its warmth did little to ease the sense of dread creeping into their hearts. The quiet was unnatural, and every snap of a twig seemed amplified in the eerie silence. Half an hour later, they'd settled into nervous chatter, each trying to dismiss the growing unease that gnawed at the edges of their minds. But then, just as Jack was recounting another urban legend, a sound drifted through the trees, a faint, soft whisper that sent shivers down their spines. The friends fell silent, staring into the darkness. Did anyone hear that?" Lisa asked, her voice barely a whisper. The others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one answered. They had all heard Ita murmur so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But the wind didn't call out names. Jack laughed nervously, shrugging. "Probably just an animal. Or, the ghost of that woodsman." But his joke fell flat, and a strange chill crept over the group. The sound had felt almost personal, as if it was meant just for them. The next day dawned, but the forest was no less foreboding in the daylight. Shadows clung stubbornly to the ground, and the silence was still absolute. They decided to hike deeper into the woods, hoping to find a stream they'd read about in the guidebook. As they walked, Lisa felt an odd sensation prickling at the back of her neck, as if someone was watching her. She spun around, but there was no one there, only the dark, silent trees standing sentinel. She shook her head, trying to brush off the feeling, but the unease only grew with each step. Around midday, they stumbled upon an old cabin hidden in the underbrush. Its wooden walls were weathered and rotting, half covered in moss and vines. The door hung open, creaking softly in the breeze. "Looks like we've found the ghost's home," Jack joked, though his face was pale. "Wanna go inside?" The others hesitated, but curiosity won out. They stepped cautiously into the cabin. the floorboards groaning underfoot. The air was stale, thick with dust and the scent of decay. Strange symbols were scratched into the walls, spiraling patterns that seemed to dance in the dim light. As they explored, Mike found a bundle of old, tattered letters in a drawer. The paper was brittle, and the ink had faded, but they could just make out fragments of words, pleas for help, mentions of voices, and something about a ritual. The last line sent a chill down their spines. The forest has eyes. It sees you. It wants you. A sudden, sharp noise echoed from outside, like the snap of a branch underfoot. They froze, eyes darting to the door. But when they stepped outside, there was no one there, only the whispering trees and the lingering sensation of being watched. That night, back at their campsite, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, insistent, echoing through the trees like a chant. Lisa lay in her tent, her heart pounding as the voices grew clearer. They were saying her name, calling her, luring her into the darkness. She clenched her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The whispers seemed to seep into her mind, wrapping around her thoughts like a fog. In the morning, Lisa looked pale, her eyes haunted. "Did anyone else hear them?" she whispered. The others nodded, their faces drawn and fearful. None of them had slept. Each of them had heard the voices, calling, whispering secrets too terrible to repeat. The group decided to leave the forest, but as they packed up, they found their compass spinning wildly, and their phones had lost all signal. It was as if the forest itself was trapping them, keeping them bound within its shadows. As they walked, trying to find their way back, they realized that the trees seemed to shift around them, changing positions, leading them deeper instead of toward the exit. Panic set in, and they began to run, desperate to escape. But the forest stretched on endlessly, a labyrinth of darkness and whispers. The group pressed forward, but the forest's pathways twisted unnaturally. No matter which direction they took, the landmarks seemed to repeat, and soon they realized they'd been walking in circles. A thick fog rolled in, blanketing the ground and limiting their vision to only a few feet ahead. Every step was a guess, every direction as hopeless as the last. Mike, usually calm and collected, began to panic. His breathing quickened as he muttered to himself, frantically looking over his shoulder. "This can't be real," he whispered. "Forests don't just trap people. This is impossible." Jack tried to put on a brave face. "It's probably just fog. We'll get through this, keep walking, stick together." But each time they thought they found a way out, they ended up back where they'd started. By afternoon, exhaustion had set in, and their nerves were frayed. "Wait, look!" Sarah suddenly gasped, pointing through the trees. There, barely visible through the fog, was the shape of a personal figure, standing still, just at the edge of sight. They were draped in tattered clothes, their head bowed, hair hanging loosely over their face. The group froze, hearts pounding, unsure if what they were seeing was real. "Hello?" Jack called out, his voice shaky. Are you lost too?" The figure remained silent, unmoving. But as the friends stared, the figure slowly lifted its head, and Lisa let out a gasp. The face was shadowed, but its eyes were hollow deep, dark voids that seemed to pull them in, empty yet full of a haunting sorrow. Then, In a voice barely louder than a whisper, it spoke. "Leave, while you can." And with that, the figure vanished, dissolving into the fog as if it had never been there. Night fell quickly, swallowing what little daylight remained. They decided to make camp again, fearing the unknown, but knowing they were too exhausted to keep wandering in circles. The fire they built seemed small and fragile against the vast darkness that pressed in around them, and even its warmth did little to lift their spirits. Lisa couldn't shake the image of the figure's hollow eyes. They were haunting, filled with a sadness that she couldn't describe. That person, they looked like they'd been here for years. "Do you think they were?" "Don't say it," Jack interrupted, his voice rough. "I don't want to think about that right now." As the fire crackled, they tried to sleep, but the forest was restless. The whispers returned, louder this time, weaving through the trees, carrying words they couldn't quite understand. Shadows flickered just beyond the firelight, moving in ways that shadows shouldn't. The friends huddled closer together, their nerves stretched thin. At some point, they began hearing footsteps, slow, dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the ground. The sound grew closer, stopping just at the edge of their camp. Lisa held her breath, clenching her hands tightly as the footsteps paused, then began again, circling them. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but the footsteps continued, unrelenting, slow and deliberate. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the silence, echoing through the trees. The group jumped, their eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't a scream of fear. It was one of pure anguish, a soul-wrenching cry that seemed to come from every direction at once. The next morning, the friends were drained and rattled, their minds numb from the horrors of the night. They agreed to keep moving, hoping that daylight might give them a better chance of escape. As they walked, they stumbled upon something strange, an old, weathered stone, half buried in the dirt. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, similar to the ones they had seen in the cabin. Mike examined the stone, frowning. These symbols, they look like they're part of a ritual, something ancient. Sarah shuddered, glancing around as if the trees themselves were listening. "What kind of ritual?" "I don't know," Mike replied. "But it seems like some kind of curse. Maybe that's why the forest feels wrong." They pressed on, hoping to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the cursed ground. But as they continued, they found more stones scattered along their path, each one bearing the same ominous symbols. It was as if the forest was trying to keep them close, leading them deeper with each step. As the day wore on, they found themselves at a clearing where the ground was scorched, blackened as if by fire. Bones, half buried and scattered, lay across the ground, brittle and ancient. Lisa knelt, picking up a fragment, her face pale. These are human bones." A sudden gust of wind whipped through the clearing, sending leaves swirling around them. The whispers returned, louder, insistent, and a voice spoke clearly this time, hollow and mournful. "You cannot leave. None of us can." The friends stood paralyzed, the weight of the voice pressing down on them. It was a plea, a warning, and a curse all at once. They realized, with a sinking dread, that the spirits bound to the forest were prisoners, trapped in a purgatory with no escape. As night fell once again, they gathered close, barely speaking, each of them haunted by the truth they'd uncovered. They were not the first to be trapped here, and unless they found a way out, they would join the countless others who had vanished into the forest, leaving only whispers behind. In the dead of night, Lisa awoke to the sound of footsteps again. Only this time, they were inside their camp. She sat up, her eyes wide with terror, and saw Jack standing at the edge of the firelight, his face blank, eyes unseeing. "Jack," she whispered, but he didn't respond. He turned slowly, walking into the darkness, as if in a trance. Lisa scrambled to her feet, grabbing Mike and Sarah, and they chased after him, calling his name. But Jack didn't turn back. He kept moving deeper into the trees, his movements stiff and unnatural. "Jack, stop!" Mike shouted, but it was as if Jack couldn't hear them. Just as they reached him, Jack vanished into the shadows, disappearing as if he had been swallowed by the forest itself. They searched desperately, calling his name, but there was no answer, only the haunting echo of their voices. In the end, they returned to their camp without him, their hearts heavy with grief. They knew, deep down, that Jack was gone, that the forest had claimed him, as it had claimed so many others before. With Jack gone, fear tightened its grip on the group. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to press in, no longer hiding their intent. Each step they took seemed to lead them further into the forest's clutches. It became clear to them that there was no simple way out, and that whatever force haunted these woods had been waiting to trap new souls within its cursed boundaries. Lisa took charge, her voice steady though her eyes betrayed her terror. "We need a plan," she said, glancing between Sarah and Mike. "The whispers, the stones, the symbols. They're all connected to something. If we can figure out the ritual, maybe we can break whatever curse is keeping us here." Mike hesitated, glancing around as if afraid the trees might hear him. "You mean a ritual to escape? But what if we don't know what we're doing? We could end up making things worse." Lisa didn't waver. "We're already caught in something we don't understand. We've lost Jack. If we don't at least try, we're going to die here too." Sarah, though hesitant, nodded. "Let's go back to the stones. There might be something we missed, a clue, instructions. Anything." With no other choice, they returned to the clearing with the strange stones, their footsteps echoing in the dead silence. This time, they examined the stones more carefully. Lisa traced the symbols, her fingers feeling the grooves of the ancient carvings. She noticed that some of the stones had markings similar to those they'd found in the cabin, almost as if they formed part of a larger message. After hours of careful examination, they pieced together fragments of what they assumed was an incantation or chant. It was written in an archaic language, one they didn't fully understand. But there were phrases they could make out, words that hinted at release, freedom, and sacrifice. "It says something about an offering to the forest," Sarah murmured, squinting at the rough etchings. "An offering? But what does it want?" Before they could speculate further, a strange, suffocating chill settled over the clearing. The fog thickened, and the light seemed to dim, even though the sun was still high. And then they heard it, a low, mournful voice that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. A voice that was both ancient and sorrowful. "Your freedom requires a sacrifice." The words echoed through their minds, as if the forest itself was speaking. They stared at each other, fear creeping into their eyes. A sacrifice. The meaning was all too clear. One of them had to stay, to give their life so that the others might escape. The weight of the forest's demand hung over them, oppressive and unrelenting. Each of them felt the dread settle deep in their bones as they realized what it meant. There would be no escape without a terrible price. Mike shook his head, his voice trembling. No way. There has to be another way out. This can't be the only choice. Sarah hugged her knees, silent tears streaming down her face. She couldn't bear the thought of losing another friend to the forest. But deep down, she knew the truth. The forest wouldn't let them go without claiming another soul. Lisa, however, seemed eerily calm. She met their eyes, her expression resolute. I'll stay. The words hung in the air, shocking them into silence. Mike and Sarah stared at her, unable to believe what they were hearing. No, Lisa, Sarah choked, shaking her head. We can't lose you too. But Lisa's mind was made up. She knew that this was their only chance. And she couldn't bear the thought of watching her friends suffer the same fate as Jack. If one of us has to stay, it might as well be me. You two have a chance to live. Take it. Mike grabbed her arm, desperation in his eyes. There has to be another way. We'll keep searching, keep trying. Don't give up yet. But Lisa shook her head. She knew the forest had already made its demand, and nothing they could do would change its will. If she stayed behind, maybe her friends would find freedom, and that was a sacrifice she was willing to make. As darkness fell, Lisa prepared herself for the ritual. She felt a strange sense of calm, as if the forest had already claimed her soul. She stood in the center of the clearing, reciting the fragmented words they had pieced together, calling upon the spirits of the forest to release her friends. The wind picked up, swirling around her in a vortex of whispers and shadows. The stones seemed to pulse with an eerie light, casting long, ghostly shadows across the clearing. She could feel the presence of countless souls, watching, waiting, drawn to her sacrifice. As she finished the incantation, the fog thickened, engulfing her in a blinding haze. She could hear her friends calling her name, but their voices were distant, fading into the void. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the wind died down, and the forest fell silent. When the fog lifted, Lisa was gone. Mike and Sarah stood in stunned silence, the weight of her sacrifice settling over them like a leaden shroud. The forest, it seemed, had accepted her offering. The path before them was clear, the trees no longer twisting to trap them. They could feel if the curse had lifted, if only for them. With heavy hearts, they turned and walked out of the forest, never looking back, leaving behind the memory of their friend and the haunted woods that would forever keep her soul. Months later, Mike and Sarah returned to the edge of the forest, haunted by the memories of that fateful trip. They had tried to put it behind them, but the shadows of the past clung to them, a constant reminder of the price they had paid. As they stood at the forest's edge, they heard it, the faint, mournful whisper of their friend, calling to them from deep within the trees. Leave while you can. They turned away, their hearts heavy, knowing that Lisa's soul was bound to the forest, a guardian of its secrets, a silent witness to its dark history. The forest had claimed her, as it had claimed so many before, and it would continue to claim more, feeding on the fear and despair of those who dared to wander too deep into its shadows. The Whispering Woods would always hunger, waiting patiently for the next soul to enter its embrace. Despite their attempts to move on, the events of Black Hollow Forest haunted Mike and Sarah. They'd tried to bury the memories, but nightmares plagued their sleep, each one bringing them back to the whispers, the shadows, and the last sight of Lisa disappearing into the fog. No matter how much they tried to convince themselves it was over, a part of them knew that the forest wasn't done with them. 1 year later, they received an anonymous letter in the mail. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, and the paper smelled faintly of damp earth. The message was brief. The forest remembers. It wants you back. Sarah's hands trembled as she read it aloud, her voice shaking. She looked at Mike, the terror in her eyes mirrored in his own. "Do you think it's her?" Sarah whispered. Mike clenched his jaw, unwilling to voice what they were both thinking. The letter, the memories, the nightmares, it felt like a warning. Or worse, a summons. "Maybe it's just someone messing with us," he said, though his tone was unconvincing. Maybe someone heard about what happened and thought this would be funny. But Sarah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No one else knew we went there, and who would know about Lisa?" They sat in silence, each grappling with their fear. Deep down, they knew the truth. The forest hadn't let go. It had taken Lisa, and now, for reasons beyond their understanding, it wanted them back.